There was a time when I believed family was everything. I gave up my own dreams, my own time, to make sure my son had everything he needed. I thought that bond, that unconditional love, would last forever. But as the years passed, something changed. My son, Matt, grew older, and with each passing year, he drifted further away. The phone calls became less frequent, the visits non-existent, and eventually, I became a shadow in his life. I tried to hold on, but it was as if I was no longer needed, no longer important. There was no birthday wish, no I love you. Nothing. For years, I waited, hoping for a sign, for some acknowledgement that he still cared. But none came. Then, one day, the phone rang. It was Matt. I couldn't believe it. He was at rock bottom. His job was gone, his girlfriend had left, and he had nowhere else to turn. I didn't hesitate. Despite the pain of those years of silence, I opened my door to him. I gave him a place to stay and advice on how to get back on his feet. But what Matt didn't know was that I wasn't just offering him help. I was teaching him a lesson about family, respect, and gratitude. What happened next shocked him. After everything, after years of neglecting me, he learned the hard way that family is not just about being there when it's convenient. It's about being there, no matter what. Meet Donald, a man whose life revolved around his son, Matt. From the moment Matt was born, Donald became the proudest father anyone could imagine. He worked tirelessly to provide for his family, always putting their needs before his own. It was never about the job title or the paycheck for Donald. It was about being there for his son, guiding him, shaping him, and ensuring that Matt had the tools to build a successful life. He didn't care if he had to work late nights or miss out on personal dreams. His focus was always on Matt's future. When Matt took his first steps, Donald was right there, his hands ready to catch him if he stumbled. When Matt learned to ride a bike, Donald held onto the back of the seat, running beside him, making sure his son felt the thrill of independence, but also the safety of knowing his father was there. Every school play, every soccer game, every milestone in Matt's life, Donald was the constant, cheering him on from the sidelines, giving advice when needed, and being the rock Matt could always lean on. It wasn't just about providing the material things. Matt's well-being, happiness, and success were at the center of Donald's world. But life wasn't always easy. Donald sacrificed a lot to make sure Matt had everything he needed. He put off his own desires, gave up personal goals, and spent years working long hours to pay the bills and send Matt to the best schools. There were times when Donald longed for a break, a moment to focus on his own life, but every time he thought about it, he reminded himself that Matt was his priority. This was the life Donald had chosen, and it never occurred to him that, one day, he might find himself alone, forgotten by the one person he had given everything for. As Matt grew older, Donald started noticing subtle changes. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't a sudden betrayal. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. The first sign was the phone calls. Matt, who used to call his father every week just to check in or chat about his day, began to call less often. It started with just a few weeks between calls, then a month, then months. Donald would sit by the phone, waiting for it to ring, but it rarely did. And when it did, the conversations were short, rushed, and impersonal. Matt was busy with school, with friends, with life, and his father became less and less important. The visits became even rarer. Donald would make excuses to visit Matt, drive the hours it took to see him, but Matt seemed to always have something else going on. "I'm busy, Dad," he'd say, or "I've got plans with friends." Donald tried not to take it personally, tried to remind himself that Matt was growing up, that it was normal for him to want space. But the silence, the distance, grew more painful as the years passed. Donald started feeling like a stranger in his own son's life. The birthdays became a reminder of this slow drift. Where there used to be long, joyful celebrations with laughter, gifts, and family time, now Donald found himself spending those days alone. Matt's birthday calls became less frequent, and when they did happen, they felt forced, a token gesture rather than a heartfelt conversation. Donald would smile and tell himself that Matt had his own life now, that he was proud of the man his son was becoming, but deep down, the hurt was undeniable. The silence, the absence of Matt's presence in his life, was deafening. Donald didn't expect perfection, He didn't expect Matt to be by his side every moment of every day. But what stung the most was the feeling of being replaced. It wasn't just the absence of calls and visits. It was the sense that, as Matt became more independent, Donald had become irrelevant. The man who had spent every moment of his life focused on Matt's future now found himself in a quiet house, with only memories to keep him company. For years, Donald kept hoping things would change. He believed that one day, Matt would realize how much his father had done for him, that the love and sacrifices would mean something. Maybe Matt was just busy. Maybe he would come around. He held on to that hope, even as the phone remained silent and the visits were few and far between. Donald kept telling himself that his role in Matt's life wasn't over yet. But with each passing year, the gap between them grew wider. Donald began to feel invisible. And yet, through all the loneliness, through all the heartache, Donald never gave up on Matt. He never stopped caring. Even when Matt stopped calling, Donald would still remember birthdays, sending cards and gifts, hoping that his son would recognize the effort. He would sit by the window, looking out, wishing for a visit, a simple phone call. He longed for a sign that his son still needed him, still saw him as the man who had always been there. Matt's life continued on, and Donald's place in it seemed to shrink further. Matt moved to a new city, found new friends, started new relationships. It seemed like the more he grew, the more distant he became from his father. Donald was left behind in a quiet world of memories, trying to convince himself that it was just a phase, that Matt would come back. But as the years stretched on, Donald began to wonder if he would ever truly be a part of his son's life again. This wasn't what he had imagined. When Donald had imagined his son growing up, he had always pictured them spending holidays together, laughing over shared meals, enjoying each other's company, even when Matt became an adult. But that future seemed to be slipping away. It was as if Matt had forgotten everything his father had done for him. The long hours, the sacrifices, the unconditional love. Donald felt invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. And no matter how much he tried to justify it or rationalize it, the pain was undeniable. This was the reality of Donald's life when the phone rang that day. He had no idea that a simple call would change everything. He had no idea that, after all the years of silence, the one person who had pushed him away so completely would suddenly need him. And when Matt called, desperate and broken, Donald knew one thing for sure. Despite everything, he was ready to help. Matt had built a life for himself, one that seemed to be everything he had ever wanted. He had a group of friends, a job that provided some stability, and a girlfriend who seemed to understand him in a way that no one else had. For the most part, his world was the picture of success, a young man carving his path, living independently with no one to answer to but himself. He was confident, carefree, and, for the most part, felt invincible. There was a sense of freedom in knowing he didn't need anyone, especially not his father. After all, he was his own man now, and he had spent so many years carving out his own identity, separate from the shadow of the father who had always been there. For years, Matt had hardly looked back. Life was busy, his friends kept him entertained, and his job filled his days with the structure he needed. His girlfriend, Emma, was someone he could see a future with. She was smart, attractive, and driven, someone who seemed to complement his life perfectly. They had dreams together, plans that kept them looking ahead instead of behind. He felt like he was on the right track, finally making it on his own terms. He had little time for his father, and even less for the nagging feelings of guilt that occasionally surfaced. Matt had learned to ignore them. The phone calls to Donald became increasingly rare. They started as brief check-ins, and then even those faded into nothing. Every time Donald reached out, Matt's excuses seemed more and more reasonable, more acceptable. He was too busy with work, too caught up in his own life to make time for someone who, in his mind, was just a relic of his past, a reminder of a life he had outgrown. The silence between them, though painful, was something Matt had grown used to. He convinced himself it was normal. People grow apart, right? It wasn't personal. It was just part of life. But life, as it often does, has a way of throwing curveballs, and Matt wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. His world, which had seemed so solid and secure, began to crack. It started with his job. The company he worked for, one he had been so proud of, announced a round of layoffs. It was sudden, unexpected, and devastating. Matt had worked hard, poured hours into his work, often at the expense of his relationships, including his own connection with his father. Now, it didn't matter. He was one of the unlucky ones, and just like that, his job was gone. The sense of security that had once defined his life evaporated in an instant. At first, Matt was in denial. He didn't want to admit it. He had worked too hard to let this happen, and he couldn't fathom how he would move forward. But the days turned into weeks, and the job search proved to be more difficult than he anticipated. The market was competitive, and his former employer's reputation wasn't great in the industry. Doors seemed to close at every turn. The confidence Matt had once exuded slowly withered as he found himself unable to land interviews, let alone a job. Then, his relationship with Emma started to unravel. They had been living together for some time, and their relationship had always had its ups and downs. But now, with the pressure of joblessness weighing heavily on Matt, tensions began to rise. Emma was supportive at first, but as the weeks turned into months with no progress, her patience wore thin. She wanted security, a sense of stability, and Matt couldn't give her that. The arguments grew more frequent, the silences more painful. Eventually, Emma made the decision to leave. She packed her things and walked out of the apartment they had shared, leaving Matt in the midst of a broken relationship, unsure of where to go next. Now, Matt was truly alone. The life he had built, his career, his relationship, his independence, had crumbled beneath him, and all he was left with was a sinking feeling in his chest and a growing sense of desperation. The reality of his situation was becoming clearer with each passing day. He had no job, no girlfriend, no direction. His friends, the ones who had once been so eager to hang out and make plans, started drifting away as well. They had their own lives, their own commitments, and they could only offer so much support before they, too, grew weary of hearing about Matt's misfortune. Slowly, Matt realized that the life he had spent years building was nothing more than a fragile house of cards, and it had all come crashing down. In his darkest moments, when the weight of failure seemed unbearable, there was only one person he could think of, his father. It was a thought that gnawed at him, one he had pushed away for so long, but now, in his time of need, it was unavoidable. The same man who had been there for him when he took his first steps, the man who had worked tirelessly to provide for him, the man who, despite all the years of silence, had never stopped caring. Donald. Matt hated the idea of calling him. It felt like admitting failure, like acknowledging that he had made a mess of everything. The guilt, the shame of having ignored his father for so long, weighed heavily on his shoulders. But what other choice did he have? His friends were no longer there for him. His girlfriend was gone, and his job prospects seemed bleak. In his heart, he knew that the one person who might still care, the one person who could help him get back on his feet, was his father. With a sigh, Matt reached for the phone. His hand trembled as he dialed the number he had long since memorized. As the phone rang, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What would his father say? Would he be angry? Would he even answer? After all, it had been years since their last real conversation, years since Matt had reached out. But when the line picked up and Donald's familiar voice greeted him, Matt felt an overwhelming rush of relief. "Dad, it's me," Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a brief pause on the other end. Donald's voice, soft but steady, replied, "Matt, it's been a long time. How are you?" In that moment, the floodgates opened. All the hurt, all the guilt, all the years of silence seemed to vanish as Matt poured out his heart, telling his father everything. The job loss, the breakup, the overwhelming feeling of being lost. Donald listened quietly, not interrupting, but Matt could sense the concern in his voice. Without hesitation, Donald said, "You're my son, Matt. I'm here. You can stay with me. We'll figure this out." For the first time in what felt like forever, Matt felt the warmth of unconditional love, the kind of love he had long ignored but now desperately needed. And so, with no other options left, Matt returned home to the one place he had long since abandoned, the arms of his father. Donald had spent years in quiet solitude, watching the seasons change while the phone on his kitchen counter sat still, never ringing. He had dedicated his life to providing for Matt, sacrificing his own happiness, his own dreams, and even his own time so that Matt could have every opportunity. But over time, Donald began to feel the heavy weight of abandonment, the emptiness of silence from the son he had once been so close to. For all his years of effort, for all the sacrifices he had made, it seemed that Matt had simply outgrown him. The phone calls stopped coming. The visits became infrequent, and the once vibrant relationship between father and son dwindled into a distant memory. There were moments when Donald would walk into the room, his eyes scanning the empty spaces of their home, wondering where it all went wrong. He had poured everything into Matt, his love, his time, his hard work. But as Matt entered adulthood, the father-son bond that had once been so strong started to dissolve. Donald, try not to let the pain show, try not to dwell on the feeling of abandonment that gnawed at his chest. He convinced himself that Matt was just busy, that it was normal for young adults to drift from their parents as they found their own way in the world. But deep down, Donald felt the ache of being forgotten, the sting of being discarded. Every year, Donald sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, always hoping that maybe this time Matt would reach out, maybe this time he would acknowledge the years of care and love. But each attempt went unnoticed, and soon, Donald stopped expecting anything in return. It wasn't about the gifts or the cards. It was about the simple acknowledgement, a simple, "I'm thinking of you, Dad." That's all he wanted. But as time passed, Donald's heart grew heavier, the longing for his son's presence growing more desperate with each passing year. But despite the pain, despite the silence, Donald never gave up. He couldn't. Matt was his son, and no matter how distant or unreachable he seemed, Donald still held onto the hope that one day, Matt would remember who he was. He never allowed himself to hate his son, never allowed the resentment to completely consume him, even though every inch of him longed to feel some kind of reciprocation. He couldn't help it. He loved Matt too much. Then, one day, the unexpected happened. The phone rang. Donald's heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the caller ID. It was Matt's name, something he hadn't seen in years. The familiar ring of the phone brought back a flood of memories, memories of simpler times when he and Matt would laugh and talk for hours. Donald took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands as he answered the call. "Matt?" he said, his voice shaky with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The voice on the other end was hesitant, filled with the rawness of someone who had nowhere else to turn. Matt's words were fragmented, like he didn't quite know how to begin. "Dad, I don't know where to go. I lost my job. Emma, she left me. I don't have anyone else." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Donald's heart broke as he heard the pain in Matt's voice. This was the son he had raised, the son who had once looked up to him, now asking for help. Donald didn't hesitate. He never even thought twice. Without a second thought, he immediately offered Matt a place to stay, a roof over his head until he could get back on his feet. He wasn't sure what had happened in Matt's life, but none of that mattered. His son needed him, and that was all that mattered in that moment. As Matt arrived at Donald's home, Donald tried to hide the wave of emotions that surged inside him. There was a sense of relief, but also a deep sadness. The years of neglect were not easily erased, and as he opened the door to welcome his son back, Donald couldn't help but feel the weight of all the lost time between them. Matt, now a young man, stood at the threshold, looking worn and defeated. He looked like a stranger, yet he was still his son, the same boy who had once run into his arms with joy and excitement. "Come in, Matt," Donald said, his voice soft but steady, trying to mask the storm of emotions swirling within him. He knew this moment was more than just offering shelter. It was an opportunity to rebuild something that had been broken, something that might never be the same again. But Donald wasn't looking for perfection. He just wanted to help his son, to show him that he was still there, that he still cared. The days that followed were difficult for both of them. Matt didn't speak much about what had happened, but Donald could see the weight of his son's failures written all over his face. He could see the shame in Matt's eyes every time he looked in the mirror, the sense of defeat that hung heavy in the air. Donald didn't push. He didn't demand answers. He just provided a steady presence, offering meals, a quiet place to sleep, and most importantly, advice when Matt was ready to take it. But as much as Donald wanted to simply help Matt get back on his feet, there was something more important that he needed to do. This time, things couldn't go back to the way they were. He couldn't simply open his door and let Matt stay without addressing the years of pain and silence. Donald knew that helping Matt wasn't just about providing for him physically. It was about teaching him a lesson that could change their relationship forever. One evening, after dinner, Donald sat Matt down in the living room, a quiet tension filling the air. Matt looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, unsure of what his father was going to say. Donald took a deep breath, his mind racing. The time had come for him to speak his truth, to express the hurt he had carried for so long. "Matt, I've spent years waiting for you," Donald began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've waited for your calls, your visits, any sign that you still cared about me. I gave up everything for you, worked so hard to make sure you had everything you needed. But somewhere along the way, I was forgotten. And that hurt me, son. It hurt more than you can imagine." Matt shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his father's gaze. Donald saw the conflict in his eyes, the guilt, the shame, the realization that he had caused this pain. But Donald wasn't done yet. This was his chance to show Matt that family wasn't something you take for granted, that love wasn't a one-way street. "You didn't just lose a job, Matt," Donald continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You lost a lot more than that. You lost me. And while I'm here to help you, I want you to understand something. This isn't just about putting a roof over your head. This is about you learning what it means to appreciate those who love you, to understand the importance of respect and gratitude." Matt sat quietly, his eyes filled with tears. He had never heard his father speak like this before. It was a revelation, an awakening for both of them. Donald's lesson wasn't about bitterness. It was about teaching Matt to value what really mattered. It was about showing him that love is not something you can take for granted, that the people who care about you are worth fighting for. Donald knew that this conversation, this lesson, was just the beginning of something deeper, something that could change the trajectory of their relationship forever. The days following that conversation were a quiet turning point, both for Donald and Matt. Matt, though initially uncomfortable with the weight of his father's words, began to reflect on the depth of the pain he had caused. The sense of shame that hung over him seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. He had spent so many years focused on himself, on building a life that was solely about him and his needs, that he had failed to see the impact his neglect had on the one person who had always been there for him, his father. The guilt was overwhelming, but at the same time, there was a strange relief in finally hearing Donald's truth. For the first time in years, Matt understood the depth of the love his father had given him, a love that had been taken for granted. Donald, for his part, had no expectations that Matt would change overnight. He had learned over the years that true change takes time. But the moment they shared was the beginning of something real. Donald continued to offer support, not out of obligation, but because he believed in his son. There were no demands, no ultimatums, just a quiet patience that spoke louder than any words could. Donald knew that helping Matt rebuild his life would take more than just offering a place to stay. It would take time, understanding, and above all, trust. In the following weeks, Matt started taking small steps to get his life back on track. He began applying for jobs with a renewed sense of determination, and Donald was there, offering advice when needed, guiding him through the process. But it wasn't just the practical support that mattered. It was the emotional support, the sense of being there for Matt when he needed it most. Donald listened when Matt spoke about his failures, his frustrations, and his fears. He didn't try to fix everything or offer empty reassurances. Instead, he let Matt work through his emotions, allowing him to find his own way. It was a quiet, powerful form of guidance, one that Matt hadn't realized he needed. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Matt looked over at his father, the man who had once seemed so distant, so far removed from his life, and yet, now, was closer than anyone else. He realized, with a jolt of understanding, how much his father had always been there, even when he was forgotten. Donald hadn't just been the man who had provided for him financially. He had been the steady, silent force in the background, always there, never demanding, always waiting. It was a revelation that struck Matt with the force of 1,000 realizations. In that moment, Matt knew he had to do something to show his father that he had learned. He had to prove that he understood the value of what Donald had given him, that he recognized the sacrifices his father had made. It wasn't just about finding a job or fixing his personal life. It was about healing the rift between them, rebuilding the trust that had been shattered over the years. Matt knew it would take time, but he was willing to put in the effort. For the first time in years, he was willing to fight for his relationship with his father. One evening, after another long day of job applications and quiet reflection, Matt found himself sitting next to Donald on the porch. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the house, and for a moment, everything felt still, as if the world had paused just for them. Matt took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words before he spoke. "Dad," he said quietly, I want to thank you for everything, for never giving up on me, for always being there, even when I didn't deserve it. I see it now. I see everything you've done for me, and I'm sorry I didn't recognize it sooner." Donald turned to him, his eyes filled with quiet pride, but also with something else, something deeper, more knowing. "It's never too late, Matt," he said softly. "You're my son. I'll always be here for you. But I want you to remember something. You don't have to do this alone. You've got me. You've got us. And we're in this together." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and understanding. Matt could feel the shift, the change in the air. The gap that had once seemed so vast between them was slowly closing, not because of grand gestures, but because of something far more powerful, the quiet, steadfast love between a father and his son. In the weeks that followed, Matt did get a new job. It wasn't exactly what he had imagined for himself, but it was a start. More than that, though, he began to rebuild his sense of self-worth. He started to understand that success wasn't about the things he had achieved. It was about the people he had around him, the relationships that mattered, and the love that had always been there, even when he hadn't been able to see it. But the biggest change was in the relationship between Matt and Donald. They began to spend more time together, not out of obligation, but out of a newfound understanding. They would sit together over coffee in the mornings, talking about everything and nothing at all. They would laugh about old memories, share stories of their day, and slowly, the walls between them crumbled. Matt's promise to his father wasn't just about never abandoning him again. It was about recognizing the importance of family, of showing up for the people who love you, even when it's not easy. And in return, Donald didn't just welcome Matt back into his home. He welcomed him back into his heart, with open arms and a quiet strength that Matt had always relied on, even when he hadn't known it. In the end, the lesson Donald had taught was simple but profound. Love, respect, and gratitude are the foundation of family. And sometimes, it takes losing everything to realize what truly matters. As Matt stayed with his father, life began to take on a different rhythm. Each morning, Donald would prepare breakfast as usual, a quiet gesture that Matt had long taken for granted. But now, in this new chapter, every meal together felt like a small step toward rebuilding the bridge that had once connected them so strongly. The tension between them, while still present, began to loosen with time. Matt was no longer the young man who had turned his back on his father. He was a man humbled by his own failures, by the weight of his mistakes, and by the overwhelming realization of how much he had missed in his pursuit of independence. Donald didn't just offer a roof over Matt's head. He offered the guidance and support that only a father could provide. For the first time in years, Matt felt what it was like to be truly cared for, not out of obligation, but out of love. Donald had never once made him feel like a burden. Even though Matt could sense the pain that Donald had carried for years, his father never pointed out the neglect or the missed birthdays, the years of silence. Instead, Donald quietly guided Matt through the rebuilding process. He helped him look for new job opportunities, supported him as he fine-tuned his resume, and even drove him to interviews, all while offering advice with the patience that only years of experience could bring. Each small success, like securing a few interviews, brought a flicker of hope back into Matt's life. Donald had never once asked for anything in return. He had spent decades quietly supporting Matt, providing for him, loving him unconditionally, without hesitation or expectation. Donald's sacrifices were invisible to Matt for so long, buried under the haze of his own selfish pursuits, his own desire for independence. Matt had believed that he didn't need anyone, that the world was his to conquer on his own, that he could rise or fall without leaning on anyone. But now, as he sat in the very same house that his father had worked so hard to provide, Matt understood how wrong he had been. The realization was overwhelming. It was like a wave crashing over him, pulling him under with the sheer force of it. For so long, he had ignored the signs, the missed calls, the lonely birthdays, the absence of a father who had always been there, even when he wasn't needed. He had taken it all for granted. He had assumed that his father would always be there, no matter how much distance he put between them. But that wasn't how life worked, was it? People weren't forever, and relationships couldn't be built on a foundation of neglect. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of Matt's breathing, shaky and uneven. He was struggling to find the words to apologize, to explain the flood of emotions coursing through him. But the truth was, he didn't know how. How do you apologize for years of abandonment? How do you take back the years you've wasted, the years of turning your back on someone who never gave up on you? He didn't have the answers. What he had now was the deep, gnawing understanding of the pain he had caused. And it was a pain that was not easily undone. Donald sat quietly beside him, waiting. He knew what Matt was going through. He had felt this same weight on his shoulders many times before, though he had never let it show. As a father, he had learned that love wasn't about expecting anything in return. It was about being there, whether your son called or not, whether they needed you or not. Donald had always known that Matt would figure it out eventually. He just hoped it wouldn't be too late. And now, as Matt sat beside him, looking so lost in his own guilt, Donald knew that it wasn't too late. The fact that Matt was here, finally recognizing his mistakes, was the beginning of something new. The silence in the room stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared moment of reflection, of understanding. Matt's eyes met his father's, and for the first time in years, he truly saw him. Not just as his father, the man who had raised him, but as a human being, someone who had dreams, disappointments, and a lifetime of experiences that Matt had never even thought to consider. In that moment, Matt understood what it meant to love and to be loved. His father's love wasn't something he could take for granted anymore. It was something that needed to be cherished, protected, and reciprocated. Matt wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the tears finally falling freely now. But they were no longer just tears of regret. They were the tears of someone who was waking up to the truth of his own faults, and the truth of the love that had always been there, waiting for him to recognize it. He felt like a fool, a man who had wasted so much time, but he also felt a sense of clarity that he had never felt before. It wasn't just about getting a job or fixing his personal life. It was about healing the relationship with the one person who had always believed in him. Dad. Matt's voice cracked as he spoke, the words slipping out in a broken whisper. I've been so wrong. I don't know how I let it get this far. You've given me everything, and I've taken you for granted. Donald's gaze softened as he looked at his son. There was no anger, no frustration, only understanding. He knew Matt was trying to make sense of everything, trying to put into words the feelings he had kept buried for so long. Donald didn't need a perfect apology. What mattered was that Matt was finally awake to the reality of his actions. The fact that Matt was acknowledging his mistakes was enough. You don't need to apologize, Matt, Donald said quietly. I know you've been struggling, but you've learned something, and that's what matters. You're my son, and I'll always be here for you no matter what. Matt shook his head, still unable to fully absorb the magnitude of what his father was saying. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to deserve it, Matt, Donald replied softly. I've loved you every step of the way. Even when you couldn't see it, I was always here. And I'll continue to be, no matter what. What matters now is what you do next. You're not the same person you were before. You've learned. You've grown. And that's enough for me. Matt felt a rush of relief, mixed with the overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had been given a second chance, not just to rebuild his life, but to rebuild the most important relationship he had ever known. And in that moment, a promise was born, one that he would hold to for the rest of his life. He made a vow, deep in his heart, that he would never again forget what truly mattered. Never again would he take his father's love for granted. Never again would he distance himself from the person who had given everything for him. And with that promise came a new sense of purpose, a new chapter in both his life and his relationship with Donald. A chapter of healing, of gratitude, and of love. The days after that conversation felt different. There was a quiet shift in the air, something unspoken but deeply understood. Matt's promise to never forget what truly mattered wasn't just words. It was a turning point. He woke up each day with a new perspective, his heart lighter, and his mind clearer. For the first time, he felt like he was living with intention, no longer drifting through life, detached from the things that truly held meaning. Every morning, as he sat at the kitchen table with Donald, he found himself more present, more engaged in the small moments that had once seemed insignificant. It was as if the veil of indifference that had clouded his vision for so long had finally been lifted. Matt's relationship with his father began to blossom in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't about grand gestures or sudden transformations. It was the small, steady moments that mattered. He began to show up for Donald, not just physically, but emotionally. He started asking how his father was doing, genuinely caring about his day, his thoughts, and his well-being. These simple acts of connection were the foundation of something real, something that had been missing for years. Matt's gratitude became evident in everything he did. He helped around the house more, not out of obligation, but out of a deep desire to show his father that he was no longer the selfish son who had taken everything for granted. As Matt's confidence began to grow, so did his understanding of what it meant to truly contribute to the world around him. He landed a new job, a step toward rebuilding his life, but more importantly, it gave him a sense of purpose. He worked hard, not just for himself, but for his father too. Matt knew that his success wasn't just about finding a new career. It was about showing Donald that he was worthy of the second chance he had been given. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. It wasn't about the title or the salary. It was about the responsibility, the accountability, and the pride in doing something meaningful. One evening, after a long day at work, Matt came home to find Donald sitting in his favorite chair, reading the newspaper. He paused in the doorway, looking at his father, who had always been there for him, and something inside Matt clicked. He realized that he had been blind to his father's sacrifices for far too long. Donald had never asked for recognition, never needed praise. But in that moment, Matt saw him for who he truly was, a man who had given everything for his family, a man whose love had never wavered, even when Matt had failed to see it. Matt walked over to him and sat down beside him, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Dad," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "thank you for everything. I know I've messed up, and I don't know if I can ever make up for the years I lost, but I'll never take you for granted again. I promise." Donald looked at him, a soft smile tugging at his lips. He didn't need words to understand the depth of Matt's gratitude. The warmth in Matt's eyes, the sincerity in his voice, spoke volumes. Donald reached over and patted his son's shoulder, the connection between them deeper than it had ever been. "I know you won't, Matt," Donald replied. "You've shown me you understand. And that's all I ever needed to know." At that moment, Matt knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be struggles, setbacks, and challenges. But what mattered now was that he had a foundation, one built on love, respect, and the lessons he had learned. He wasn't alone anymore, and he would never forget the one person who had always been there for him, no matter the cost. The promise Matt made that night wasn't just a fleeting vow. It was the beginning of a new chapter. It was the beginning of a life where family came first, where relationships were nurtured, and where gratitude wasn't just felt, but shown through action. And as Matt sat beside his father, the two of them shared a quiet moment, knowing that for the first time in a long time, they were exactly where they needed to be. It wasn't about the help Donald had given Matt. It was never just about providing him with a roof over his head or offering him a place to start over after everything had fallen apart. That help, while vital at the time, was only the surface of something much deeper, something that transcended physical shelter or material support. What Donald had truly done was give Matt something priceless, an opportunity to understand the true meaning of family, respect, and gratitude. He hadn't just offered his son a second chance to rebuild his life. He had offered him a chance to rebuild their relationship, to reconnect after years of silence and neglect. Donald hadn't given up on Matt, not because of any obligation, but because despite everything, he loved him. And it was that love, the love that had always been there, even when Matt couldn't see it, that ultimately became the foundation for something even more significant than just fixing a broken relationship. As the days passed and Matt began to find his footing again, he started to realize that what his father had shown him went far beyond just offering a place to stay. It was the silent lessons Donald had imparted during their time together, the quiet, steady way he had always been there, the patience he had shown, and most importantly, the unwavering support he had given without ever asking for anything in return. Donald had never once made Matt feel like he owed him, even though he could have. He could have pointed out all the years of neglect, all the ways Matt had hurt him, but he never did. Instead, he had simply been there, offering guidance, not with a sense of entitlement, but with the quiet belief that love, real, unconditional love, was enough to heal even the deepest wounds. But what Matt had come to understand now was that love, no matter how deep, can't always survive in the silence of neglect. It can't thrive when it's one-sided, when only one person is giving and the other is taking. Love can't be unconditional if it's never shown back. And for all of Matt's mistakes, the biggest lesson he had learned was that love, to be real, to be lasting, had to be a two-way street. It wasn't just about receiving. It was about giving back, showing gratitude, and being present in the lives of those who matter most. For so many years, Matt had lived with the misconception that his father's love was something he could take for granted. He had believed that no matter how far away he drifted, no matter how little he called or visited, Donald would always be there waiting for him. It wasn't until Matt hit rock bottom, until he realized that he had lost everything else, that he truly understood the depth of what his father had been offering him all along. And when Matt finally returned that love, when he stopped taking and started giving back, their relationship transformed into something stronger than it had ever been before. It was a slow process, but a steady one. Every day that passed, Matt worked harder to show his father that he was no longer the same person who had taken him for granted. He called more often, not because it was expected, but because he genuinely wanted to hear his father's voice, to know how he was doing. He spent more time with Donald, not just in passing, but in deep conversation. And while Matt was still working to rebuild his own life, he understood now that the most important thing wasn't a job, a career, or even material success. What mattered most was the people in his life, the ones who had always been there, quietly supporting him, even when he hadn't been aware of it. One evening, as they sat together, Donald spoke softly, a small smile on his face. "You know, Matt, I've always been proud of you. I may not have said it often enough, but I've always believed in you. Even when you couldn't see it, I was always here, always ready to support you." Matt looked at his father, the weight of those words sinking in. For the first time, he truly understood. He wasn't just proud of him because he had found a new job or fixed his life. Donald was proud of him for learning, for changing, for coming back to the family that had always loved him. Matt felt a lump form in his throat, a mixture of gratitude and awe at the quiet strength his father had shown him. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Dad," Matt said, his voice cracking slightly. "You've always been there for me. Even when I didn't deserve it, you never gave up on me. And I'll never take that for granted again." Donald reached over and placed a hand on Matt's shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "You don't need to thank me, son. I did what any father would do. But I'm glad you're here now. I'm glad you see it because that's what family is. It's not about being perfect. It's about being there for each other, no matter what. As the months passed, their relationship blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted. There was no dramatic reconciliation or single, defining moment that healed everything instantly. Instead, it was a gradual, steady process, small acts of kindness, of showing up for each other, of proving through actions that they were in this together. And in doing so, they both learned something vital. Love is not a passive thing. It's not something that you can simply take for granted. It's something that requires effort, understanding, and mutual respect. And once Matt understood that, once he began to give back the love his father had always shown him, their relationship became stronger than ever. It wasn't just about repairing the damage that had been done. It was about building a new foundation, one that was built on shared understanding, appreciation, and respect. It wasn't about Matt seeking forgiveness for his past mistakes. It was about Matt showing his father that he was committed to being the son Donald had always hoped he would be. And it wasn't about Donald waiting for an apology. It was about him seeing the change in Matt, seeing that his son had finally learned the lesson he had been waiting for him to learn all along. In the end, it wasn't just about the help Donald had given Matt. It was about the bond they had rebuilt together, stronger and more meaningful than it had ever been before. It was a bond forged through understanding, forgiveness, and the willingness to show love, even when it wasn't easy. And as they sat together in the quiet moments of everyday life, both father and son knew that they had found something far more valuable than any material success. They had found each other again. Have you ever felt neglected by someone you loved? Maybe it was a family member, a close friend, or someone you thought would always be there for you. It's a painful feeling, isn't it? The sense of being forgotten or overlooked by someone you gave everything for. But what if the tables were turned? What if you were the one who had distanced yourself, unknowingly pushing someone away until it was too late? How would you make things right? Would you try to rebuild that bridge, or would the distance feel too great to ever cross again? These are tough questions, and they strike at the heart of what it means to love and be loved. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Have you experienced something like this in your own life? How did it change you? Did it lead to healing or heartache? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly believe that your experiences can help others who may be going through something similar. If you found this story moving or relatable, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching stories like this one. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful moments that remind us of the importance of family, love, and second chances. Each story brings us closer together, and there are more stories on the way that will inspire and resonate with you. So, make sure to leave a comment, share this with someone who might need to hear it, and join our growing community. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us, and I can't wait to share more stories that touch the heart.